you to give a big virtual welcome to Matt Swain.
Ernie, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is impressive. I would say you guys are gluttons for punishment here, because this putting on events is hard, and you literally have hundreds of people that have come into this virtual event, because I think there is a yearning for that knowledge. I think a lot of people probably were planning on attending a conference or two this spring. Some of you may not have planned on attending, but you now have a chance to sample some of this content. Ernie went through a really impressive list of speakers. I know many of those that he noted. There's going to be some great content today. But I just wanted to first start up by thanking all of you for being here. I know this is different. We're doing a virtual event. It doesn't have the same opportunities to interact and engage, but really excited about what this will bring in terms of some new discussion to the market about communicating in the new normal. So with that, let me talk a little bit about this guy. So Ernie said this very well. I will just say that we've seen a lot of changes over the last few months. Some of us are lucky enough to be those essential services and still have our jobs. Others have been furloughed or laid off. For those with a health crisis, they've lost somebody. Others or have somebody sick today. There's a sense of isolation today. We're taking on new jobs. I'm a homeschool teacher now. It's my second career, I guess. I'm not doing very well at it, but I am a homeschool teacher. People are missing big events, the conferences that you were planning to attend, but weddings, graduations, meeting newborn family members, family vacations, our worlds have been rocked. And if there's a silver lining here for this industry, and if crisis truly breeds innovation, how do we improve on the customer communications lifecycle? How do we innovate on the value that we bring to the table for our clients, the end customer, the investor, the account holder, the member, the patient, or otherwise? So my goal with today's session is to bring some perspective, some new perspective, and maybe validate some of what you're seeing in the market as well. So let me talk a little bit about the research that we're doing within the Broadridge Communications and Customer Experience Consulting team. For those of you who know me, I love this stuff. I spend a lot of time doing research. We're always wanting to know more. We're always yearning for more information to be able to improve those experiences. So from a consumer perspective, we started conducting consumer research at the beginning of April. We've relaunched the survey every 2 weeks. So we're averaging a sample size of about 300 consumers. And we've had over 925 responses so far in the first 3 cycles. The third cycle, I actually got the data last night around 5 p.m. So I've been able to incorporate some of that into this research. But the respondents are based in the US. The demographics are diversified by age, by gender, household income, and employment status. Now, you always want to supplement what you're hearing from the consumer who doesn't spend their lives thinking about this space until we start asking them, and you get some really interesting feedback when people are like, well, I hadn't really thought about that bill or that provider relationship, but now that you ask, here's what I like, or here's what could be improved. When you supplement that with business insight, which is more of a qualitative approach than a quantitative approach, you get some really interesting insights across industries on how companies are reacting. And so we're in the process of conducting enterprise interviews. We've conducted 13 of those interviews to date. The insight that we gather is anonymized and aggregated. And then the interview demographics, the people that we're talking to, the demographics are varied by industry, by job title, company size, and that provides diversity in the sample and in the insight gathered. These interviews are continuing over the coming weeks. This first round will continue through May, but I wanted to share some of the early insights and early findings with you during this event. So let's start with this collision of our work from home and our work worlds and our home worlds in this work from home environment. And many of you will remember this BBC interview where the guy is doing the interview and his daughter walks in, and then all of a sudden the baby busts in and it busts in and comes in, and then the mother has to come flying into the room and save everybody and pull everybody out of the room. And you can see just the look on his face of just being so upset that he had this important interview and the kid's interrupted. I feel like that's thrown out the window now. But a lot of us can now empathize with where he was in that moment. I mean, you look at examples like the reporter who wasn't really thinking about how wide the pan of the camera was going to be or what the crop was going to be, and he chose not to wear pants. I promise that I do have pants on if the camera pans down. Then you have people that kind of forget that there's a camera on at all, or aren't even aware. Now there are these hot spots as you kind of navigate through the house. My wife is on a lot of video conferences, and I have to try to navigate around where her camera is coming on because I just don't want to be walking around in the background. But then you also have the pets and the kids interrupting. In this case, these are both weathermen that were doing their weather segments, and their pets and kids interrupted. I'm sure you have your own examples, but video conferencing, we've worked out a lot of the kinks, I think. A lot of people are just coming up to speed. People that you used to just have phone calls with in the past, all of a sudden now you're doing video conferences with them as well. We've really kind of changed as a way to try to make that social connection in a physically distanced world. So in some of the interviews that we conducted, we heard that. So one client said he has a daily video call with his team just to stay connected. We're sharing more now. We're learning more about each other. I actually do a show and tell every time I do a team call and show one more thing about what's in my office. But then from a client perspective, here are a few other things that we've heard. The human experience is so critically important. When the changes like this happen, it really makes you think about your livelihood and what is best for your family. And that could be you personally as an employee or someone or a head of household or otherwise. But it could also be how you're thinking about how to interact with that end customer. In times of crisis, the human element comes first, and relationships are even more important. So are you picking up the phone? Are you checking in with your customers? How are you engaging to ensure that they understand that you're there for them? And this last one is really interesting. I was actually talking to a brokerage client, and he said, nobody cares about your robo-advisor. When people are stressed out, they want to talk to a human. And there is that balance. Like the robo-advisor is important when things are good, but who can I pick up the phone and talk to when things aren't so good? And how do I, as a financial advisor, support that client? I act as their psychologist at the same time that I'm giving them that advice on their investments. And so why are people stressed out? I think you guys could probably answer a lot of these questions, but let's just look at some of the changes to the market. The economy has tanked. Just look at credit and debit card spending in different areas. Groceries, spiked and continues to be higher than normal. But man, travel and entertainment, Amex card spending down 95%, discretionary spending down 33% at Discover, travel's down 99%. And then you look at the shifting habits maybe, or new norms, where card present volume is down 45% for Visa. Contactless payments are up 150%. When I do need to go out, you can bet I'm using my contactless, Apple Watch, smartwatch, and making that payment if I can, so I don't have to interact with those POS devices. So also, if some of you are road warriors on today's webinar here, and I think it's really interesting to just look at how we've ground to a halt. And man, like when you look at this data, everybody knows that travel has changed in around the world. But when you put the data on the screen, this is TSA throughput day over day, and same period last year. On an average of 1 day a week, you had 2.5 million people going through TSA checkpoints a year ago, and now it's 170,000. Just, monumental shifts, and for a lot of you, that has kind of fed back to why that video conference is so important now. I can't be there in person, but how can I still make that connection? How can I still connect with you? Now, speaking of the how can I still connect with you, and how do you reach out? Like, what's the right thing to do for your customer? If you put your own consumer hat on, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been oversaturated with "we've got your back" type communications related to COVID-19. Here's just a sampling of my email inbox and all of the different people that companies that were reaching out. And I think it's really interesting. For those of you who know me well, in the customer journey mapping work I do, I always look at the greetings and salutations. So even just kind of pulling this communication up, I see the mix of use of Matthew and Matt and valued customer, and just member. But then I also see the hello mail merge, right? So somebody didn't quite have it right, or thank you for supporting our community at the Pebble Beach Pro-Am tournament. I wasn't there, but they thanked me for attending. So it's kind of interesting to see who's doing things well in that respect, but also we have to be careful about finding the balance of how often we communicate that we've got your back. And I thought this one interview that we did from a consumer platform called User Testing was really interesting, and I want to play you're going to hear his audio over his audio over mine here, and remember, this is just an average person. We asked him a question: hey, how do you think these companies could better serve your communications needs in the future? Doesn't normally think about this, but here's some of what he said.
Energy in particular is something that I consider essential. I wouldn't expect there to be disruptions or delays in service. So this COVID response, I really only expect this if I would be seeing a disruption in service. It's great to know that these companies are addressing this, but I'm really more focused on how this affects my daily life and not what's going on behind the scenes necessarily. So how, do I need to, pay my energy bill online? Is that the only option right now? That's something I would want to know, not necessarily what Xcel Energy is doing behind the scenes to protect their employees, even though I obviously hope that they are.
So here's a good example of, okay, we get it. If there's going to be an issue with the service, that I'd like to hear about it, but otherwise I appreciate that you have my back. We've heard enough from you, and finding that balance is really important, because some people say we appreciate all the communication and we hope you'll continue doing so. So finding that balance for your base is going to be really important. Now, one of the things that I hadn't even thought about, honestly, and I'm sure Lihia has thought about this a lot, and others in the accessibility track, but looking at the accessibility challenges, for instance, when we look at, for instance, deaf-blind people, if you look at this quote here: during the pandemic, the new forms of protection, including social distancing, masks, and gloves, only complicate communication. Many deaf-blind people can't read Braille with gloves on because their hands are desensitized, and many who have a residual sight can't lip read through masks. And those are the types of things that are really important for organizations to be cognizant of and thinking through. Similarly, for those that have been shifted to online learning environments, that coursework has been spun up really quickly, or those that have been forced into online communications. Are those ADA compliant? Possibly, maybe not. Those are things that you need to be looking at. And I think that accessibility track is going to be really important to dive deeper into this topic. Now, also there's the impact on the Postal Service, and this particular article was looking at advertising mail, and I'll talk about essential or transactional and regulatory as well. But a lot of businesses have ceased to do advertising. The mail volumes collapsed, and that decline could be as much as 60% by the end of the year. For some, they're saying, the Postal Service is saying, we're going to run out of money by the end of the summer. We need help. And I think that the tough part here is, I know that my habits have changed a little bit, but you even look at people trying to socially distance. They're also thinking about the physical mail piece, having that mail carrier come to their house and interacting with the mail, even though there are multiple articles and studies out that show that you can't contract the virus from touching your mail, or a very low chance of it. But those are the types of things that people are thinking about when they're thinking about social distancing, and that hurts the industry from a print perspective. So here's an example of somebody that really speaks to that.
Like, it's already very likely that I would go paperless, probably even more likely, because this doesn't even require human contact. Like, if I had to check my mailbox, there is a the person who delivered the mail touched the mail. And so there is a possibility of contact there, and so there's a slightly increased risk. And with paperless, it's like, yeah, your risk is 0 now. So I would definitely be more likely to go paperless.
So you can hear that he's working it out, right? He's saying it's a slightly increased risk, but then the way he's rationalizing it is, but the risk is 0 if I go paperless. And I do think that there are people that are thinking that way, and inertia has been a big reason that we haven't seen as many consumers moving from paper environments to digital. I would say another big factor of that is the experience hasn't been strong enough. So what's in it for me? Why should I go paperless? Are you going to show me a better experience? So those factors play into this. And then we are hearing from some of our clients that they're saying, you already knew that we were trying to reduce our print and mail volumes. We'd like to take advantage of this opportunity without saying we're taking advantage of this opportunity. So walking that line to introduce more of our base to digital alternatives in order to help us move that needle. So there's also that piece of this storyline. And in the consumer research, when we surveyed those consumers, we found that 60% said that they would interact differently with their providers of the types of services that we're supporting: banking, credit cards, investments, insurance, healthcare, telco, utility. We saw that 70% would change their habits related to how they grocery shop, curbside pickup, online shopping. So higher shift when you think about some of those other types of interactions, but still 60% see some level of change in interaction. And when we ask them what exactly will change, I said, you can see the word cloud at the bottom, and then some of those that said yes, I do not think we'll ever go back to the way we used to communicate with each other. I prefer to interact with brands online. I will not go back inside a bank until there's a vaccine. A lot of focus on banking and branch interactions in the responses, because I think that's for many consumers, that's where they think about the most interaction with these types of providers. Now, for those that said they don't expect a change for the long term, they're saying it has yet to affect how I communicate with any of these businesses. I don't typically interact with them anyway. I refuse to let this silly virus disrupt my life. I will not let it have any lasting impact on my habits. And so you do have both sides of this, and I would say it takes, if you look, depending on the research you look at, some people say it takes 21 days, 30 days, 66 days for new habits to form. And we're getting closer to that 66-day time frame, where depending on how long some of these temporary measures are in place, it could impact how we interact in the future. And when I talk about the paperless migration, it's interesting to look at the responses where consumers were saying that before the pandemic, when they had the chance to go paperless, how often they would, 28% would often choose to go paperless, 13% never. And so you have others in between. And we said, now that you're in the middle of this pandemic, if you were asked how often would you go paperless, and that number's gone up to 36%, and that's been pretty consistent through the survey over survey tracking. So every 2 weeks we're doing the survey, and that's been pretty consistent. So 36% now saying often, 10% never. So there is this shift of people moving from never evers to maybes, and also those saying, you know what, I don't need paper. Now, we also wanted to compare the two statements shown here. One, I expect that COVID-19 will fundamentally change how I choose to communicate and engage with the companies I do business with. And then the flip side of that, I expect it will fundamentally change how businesses choose to communicate and engage with me in the future. And this was interesting to just put these two side by side, because what we found was that 50% of consumers agree that it's going to fundamentally change how they choose to communicate in the future. 59% agree that it's going to change how businesses choose to communicate with them. So they're slightly more likely to think that that businesses are going to change their ways, and they're almost expectant of changes in processes and approaches to communication. So we then took that a step further, and we said, which of your providers would you interact with differently in the future if you were to pick a couple? And the most often cited providers were banks and banking, and I think that's because of the branch, healthcare and health insurance, as well as credit cards. And the verbatims that we got related to these, and when we asked why, you can see, I will only interact online. I'll request telehealth visits before in-office visits. I actually had my first telehealth visit, and I spent half of the time talking to the PA about why we would even go back to going in person if it's just a checkup, right? Just a checkup where they don't actually have to take your vitals. And even then, I think there are alternatives. But I think it's really interesting as people start to experience what this could be, or what a new normal could be. They're being exposed to the potential of the future, and I think they're going to be more insistent on their providers figuring out a way to support them. Now, the insurers might still say, if this isn't an in-person visit, then we're not going to cover it, and that's been one of the limiting factors for a while. But now that you have so many consumers getting a taste of it, so many patients getting a taste of it, I think that does change the world a bit. I've made deposits in my bank's ATM rather than teller, so moving away from in-person interaction. I will go to interact with them less in person. I'll interact more digitally and through the apps. And we're seeing in the business research, we're asking questions about increase in e-adoption, e-payment. And I think that's been really telling. Like for one provider, they said they've had a 30% day over day increase in e-consent. And so just kind of looking at e-consent and that shift. And then from a payments perspective, we've seen 15 to 25% declines in lockbox payments. And similarly, we've seen increases in auto pay tied to electricity and utility bills, because people want to make sure the electricity is not turned off when they're spending so much time in their homes. But at the same time, you're also having people that aren't paying. And at some points, that's big money. So I think if we look at the flip side, those that they expect there to be little change from in the future, we heard most often telecommunications and utilities, and they said some might change slightly. I think most things will return to normal. I don't have face-to-face contact, so when they think about communication, they're often thinking about the way I communicate or interact in person, and I think that does influence how people are responding here. But then, haven't had any issues. I don't usually interact with them, or I already interacted via mobile app or online. And even in the word cloud, I think you could probably pick this phrase out. But if you look in the word cloud, already use online services. So the people that are expecting little change are those that are already digitally savvy. And that actually, that makes the data that much more interesting. When you think about the people that expect little change because they've already made the shift, it actually takes the balance of those people, those that haven't made a shift to digital, and actually makes that even more compelling or impactful. So I think there's always going to be a balance, and we always talk about that balance for those that still value print and mail and think that's really important. We as providers that are sending communications directly to those consumers or end recipients, you need to honor that preference, and you need to make sure that you're supporting them in the way that they want to be supported. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But when we asked about how long it takes to achieve some semblance of normalcy, this is the consumer response. And you can see 6% of consumers in this most recent cycle think that we'll be back to normal within a month. And for parts of the world, things are starting to return to some semblance of normalcy. That's a pretty open statement, though, and there's a lot of wiggle room. Like what's normal for you, and it's a new normal. It's not what was normal in the past. But what's really interesting when you look at this data and the data we've been collecting over time is if I overlay one of the trends that we're starting to see and that we'll continue to be tracking in future iterations of this survey, is respondents that cited that it'll be a year or more before they return to some semblance of normalcy has gone from 18% to 20% to now 24%. And that's a trend that's going to be an important one to continue to track, because if you have that many consumers that are now thinking that this is going to take longer to get back to some semblance of normalcy, that might also change how much these temporary measures stick for those consumers, and how do you innovate to best support them. From a client perspective, we've asked a similar question. So here are some of the responses. I can't put a time on this. It depends on what you consider normal. It won't be the same economy. For one, it's a full 6 months before any semblance of normalcy, closer to July or August if we ever get back to normal. The new business as usual will look different from the old business as usual. Travel will be cut because we know we can do more online. And we're hearing that a lot in terms of travel budgets, in terms of work from home. It's, those types of things are going to be revisited. Maybe you don't bring 8 people to the next client meeting. You bring 2, and the rest are virtual and come in on a video conference. Those are the types of things that are going to be interesting to track. Now, at the same time, because we've been so socially distanced, some people are really craving that in person, and that's going the extra mile, to use the pun, in the sense that now I've had somebody come on site, and that's been really valuable that they took the time to come on site when they could have done a video conference. Now, in the near term, are they allowed back on site? Does the client want them traveling? Does their own company want them traveling? That's what remains to be seen. From a utility perspective, they're being hit pretty hard, as are all industries. But the number of unpaid bills are stacking up, and collections agencies have been put on hold. So for this one interviewee, he said utilities will take 3 to 5 years to bounce back from all the delayed collections. They've actually just turned off their collection notice altogether because they were going to have to go in and change 100 different forms if they wanted to just change the wording on the collection. So it was easier for them to just turn it off completely. And those are the types of things that you as communications professionals are probably struggling with. Is if I look at the customer journeys, the processes in place, the triggers, what events trigger what communications, in some cases, you might be in a position where it's easier to turn something off than to modify it. And that could be because you haven't invested in improving that technology platform, or you have other challenges as a result. So we asked consumers on the back end of this research what they wanted to share with their providers. And let me just show you 9 or 10 points of feedback. One, a company who reaches out to its customers, patients, or clients shows it cares about a person, not just the bottom line. Continue to show compassion. Less email about the coronavirus, we're aware of it at this point. That goes back to that earlier statement that I made. So I think there's that balance, right? This first person, the first quote on the left, that person really likes, they want the company to continue to reach out. The next person wants them to continue to show compassion and actually gives everybody a pat on the back and says you're doing a great job. But then you also have this kind of desire for less frequency, and this is where preference management is going to become really important. Send more communication by mail, more emails or text messages. Go paperless. 3 different people, 3 different perspectives. Here's a 4th. Ask me how I prefer to be contacted and the frequency at which I'm going to want this communication. Just ask me, because you have customers that are still print-based and want to be print-based for life, and you need to figure out how to optimize that communication. You have others that are fully digital and want the newest, latest, greatest thing. And then you have a lot in between. And depending on the type of communication, they might say, well, that deems that don't even reach out if it's this. Send me an email if it's this, and pick up the phone and call me if it's that, or send me something in the mail if it's this last thing. And those are the types of things that you're trying to balance as you're thinking about your communication strategy and ensuring that you have the right tools and technologies in place to support that. So last slide on this topic. What consumers want to share with their providers: stay digital, have more staff on the phones. So when you think about from a customer service perspective, people had some long wait times because they struggled. Now, for some, it was their service center was in India and it was fully shut down. For others, their CSRs were working from the office and had to go remote, and they were still dealing with the challenges of making that transition. What's really interesting in our interviews is that a lot of companies have told us that their CSRs are more productive at home than they were before. And as long as they have the tools, the company has the tools in place to track productivity, they're less likely to demand that those CSRs come back into the office. Don't require actual paper documents. Virtual signatures are good enough. We heard a lot about that. Why do we need the wet signature? Why do we need the medallion stamp? Why can't we just all go to DocuSign or using another e-signature platform? Those are very real conversations happening across industries and even from a consumer perspective here. Leverage virtual meetings and online chats as much as possible. So the virtual meeting, think about the advisor-investor relationship, think about the telehealth visit. Those things could benefit significantly from that virtual and personal connection, but also just online chat functionality, be accessible. I think that's what it comes down to. So some of the feedback that we're getting on the remote workforce, I gave you the comment on the CSRs. Here are a few different quotes. We're thinking about what the workplace of the future looks like. When we do go back to normal, we will have fewer people in the office, desk sharing, and looking at what spaces they've leased versus owned, and can we get rid of the leased space? How do we, let's not make that next real estate investment. It's going the commercial real estate market is going to be really interesting on the backside of this, and probably not a good interesting if you're in the real estate market. But wow, I mean, it's changing how people are thinking, because all these companies that said we can never work from home are now in this world where, oh, I guess at least some of our people can work from home. For this one company, they said, we've already identified 10 to 20% of our workforce that can continue to work from home. They basically said they probably will never come back to the office besides to clean out their desks, because they don't need to be here. And if some of them prefer to be here because working from home is not the best, most conducive environment or conducive environment for them, then we'll give them that opportunity. But I would say if you continue to work remotely, just don't be this person, right? Make sure you put your pants on every day. So the bottom line here is that COVID-19 has forced slow to transform businesses into executing on digital transformation initiatives. and it's led digitally reluctant consumers to sample new ways of communicating with their providers. The longer the pandemic persists, temporary measures are more likely to become new norms. And think about the implications on all facets of that communications lifecycle. So for instance, composition, output management, e-delivery, address cleansing, return mail, accessibility, outsourcing your back office, disaster recovery, archive, preference management, overall customer experience, print optimization, communications redesign. All of these things are on the table and need to be discussed. I think this is a chance, again, if crisis truly breeds innovation, it gives you an opportunity to reset, think what's important, think about the strategy that you want to implement and where your business wants to go and how you best support that. I would say that as a result, it's going to be really important to conduct a communications assessment. You may have done some version of this in the past, but you want to ensure that you have the right people, processes, technologies, and overall experience to lead you into the next phase of business transformation. But above all, let's be human. So with that, I will say, I know Katrina has some questions waiting in the waiting room. If others have questions, I'd love to hear them. But in the meantime, in a physically distanced world, let's stay connected. Give me a call. You give me feedback on my Corona beard, whether you like it or not. Send me an email. If you want a copy of the final report of this research, it's still underway. Shoot me an email, or we're also going to host a webinar in June to review the full results. So Katrina, with that, I'll transition over to you. Do we have questions coming in?
Sorry. Thank you, Matt. That was a great presentation. So yes, we do have a few questions coming in, but as Ernie said at the beginning, if you do have any questions, please raise your hand. We will open up the chat window for you and get those questions over to Matt. So what came through while you were speaking? So you didn't mention anything about AI or chatbots. What are your thoughts on those technologies?
Yeah, great point. I think so. AI and chatbot technology, so artificial intelligence, will play a huge role from a servicing perspective. In some of the interviews that I've done for the Reimagining Communications podcast, we've talked about those in depth. But I think there's a balance. The chatbot's getting smarter. So when somebody says, I want to talk to a human, at some points they think they're talking to a human, but they're actually they're talking to a chatbot. So there is that balance of giving the perception that you're speaking with a human, but also finding that balance. I would also say it's really important when you're thinking about that journey, be really smart about when the bot flips the consumer or recipient, the person interacting, to a live human, because the frustration that can come from a circular chatbot experience is pretty painful. So it's just important to have the right levers in place and the right rules in place to escalate when needed.
Great. So how do you balance the desire to keep customers informed about how we are responding to the coronavirus without inundating them with the communications?
Yeah, I think so the example of I had 16 emails up on the screen that everybody was letting me know what their plan was. I think it's a delicate balance, and it depends on the provider. It can be a cop-out at times, but you know your base best. If you're a utility and you've already sent out your first message to say no disruption to services expected, you probably don't need to send a follow-up to say how you're protecting your employees, unless that impacts somebody coming to you for a meter reading. As a financial advisor, you probably want to communicate more frequently, because you've got people's money on the line, and they want to make sure they understand. They might not care as much about what social distancing measures they put in place to keep their business functioning, but they will care a lot about how to get in touch with you as needed as the economy evolves.
Okay, good. That makes sense. So how do we migrate more customers to e-delivery without making them think we are taking advantage of the crisis?
Yeah. Well, there's a balance. So I want to make it clear that we track the e-delivery numbers because that's always been something of interest to me. But it's not to say that that paper's out of the picture, right? There is that balance, and there are some consumers that are very adamant about wanting their paper. It's my reminder to pay. I like to review the hard copy offline. I share it with somebody, and that's not easy to do digitally. Or the digital experience just isn't good enough yet. Give me a better experience, and I'm more likely to make that transition. So I think that you have to honor preferences. If you have consumers that have repeatedly told you no versus just ignoring your communication, you probably don't want to focus on those consumers to get them to transition. But those that maybe have ignored in the past, give them the option, and maybe even give them the option, if you don't want to continue receiving this message, click here, so that interstitial doesn't come up every single time. Or I'm thinking about the digital experience for those that are dual delivery or double dippers. But from a paper perspective, do I need to keep putting that go paperless insert or that go paperless messaging on the envelope for those consumers that might value a different type of communication? I can upsell them into new services. I can get them to download the app but not go paperless. Are there other ways that I can engage versus just focusing on that cost saving metric of driving paper out of the process?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. What do you think this pandemic is going to do to the future of in-person conferences and events?
Yeah, highly relevant to today's discussion. I think it's so near term. I don't know. I think the next, just feeding off of what I'm hearing in the news. I'm no expert, but feeding off of that, the next 12 to 18 months seems like there'll be some people that are ready, like they're ready tomorrow to go back and be at that event. And others are going to be really cautious about making that transition back. And for that person that said, until there's a vaccine, I'm not going back to my bank. Now that could change as people become more comfortable, or there's this herd immunity that we've heard about. But I will say that a lot of the clients that we're talking to, they're very confident that they're going to be sponsoring events in the future. That they'll be hosting in-person events. They'll be doing those. The entertainment slush fund will come back because those interactions are so important. It's a different level of engagement. Some people go to the conference truly just for the value of the content. Other people go there for the value of the relationships they build, the water cooler conversations, and those types of things that you just can't get in the same way in a virtual interaction.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's see. What was your favorite COVID message, and what about the need to balance caring versus being offensive?
My favorite COVID message. I think that would probably assume that I read them all, besides just reading the headers. I got a COVID message from a travel company in Namibia. I actually have been there, so this wasn't that irrelevant. But they were just letting me know that this was a great time to travel to Namibia because nobody's there. And it made me want to go, but not get on that 17-hour flight to get there.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, how are companies prioritizing shifting as a result of the pandemic, beyond like digital transformation or, virtual summits and conferences?
Yeah, I think we had actually asked that as one of the survey questions, was how are your priorities shifting? For a lot of companies, they said the priorities we had in place in January are the same priorities that we have today. There have been some fire drills in between, to put it lightly. Others have said, digital was, the top 3 initiatives on our list, and now it's the top 10. We've had people that have said, depending on who we're talking to. So we talked to a digital client experience person at a large brokerage, and she said, we already had an agile framework. We were working in Scrum mode, and we we are now the model. A big spotlight has been shined on us as a result of this pandemic, and we're now the model for how the rest of the business, the other lines of business, are going to adjust their approach to technology. They're still mainframe or have other challenges. And I think that shift to the cloud has been really eye-opening for companies that realize how easy it is to scale when you're cloud-based versus being tied to your own legacy platforms.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it looks like that is all of the questions that we have for you today, Matt. Again, thank you so much for being a part of our summit today. That was a fantastic presentation and a great way to start off our day. So with that, we're going to pass